like to open with a little story. I was born Jodi White Pearson. The surname of this fellow on the left. He was my birth certificate father. He was also my mother's second husband. They were married all in all a little over 10 years. But after 2 years of serving as an Army Tank Commander in Vietnam, he came back home with what we now understand to be PTSD. And the remainder of their marriage was rather unhappy, somewhat abusive. Both began to have affairs as a means to cope with their unhappy marriage. They were sexless in their own marriage, and so it's 1970s in San Francisco. It's the home of the Grateful Dead, hot tubs, and the Summer of Love, and I think it was just what everyone did at that point. Several of Mom's affairs happened simultaneously. So it gave a specific paternal confusion when she found herself pregnant with me in 1973. She convinced herself that one of the affairs, this man on the right, his surname was Klugman. She convinced herself that he was the father and convinced him as well. Now remember, her marriage was sexless, so it was kind of a big deal that she was pregnant at all. Her affair with Klugman, both of them together decided to conceal the paternity for her sake so that she could have approval still from her Roman Catholic parents. This was her second marriage after all, and the family was already fairly disapproving of her. So somehow she convinced the Army major that he was, in fact, my dad. But eventually, 2 years into my life, they ended up divorcing anyway. She married Klugman, officially making my secret biological father my stepfather. And I ended up with 12 years of weekly Saturday visits with the Army major. Those visits were primarily neglectful. His main means of coping with his PTSD was drinking until he passed out. So I would get picked up often early, as I called my parents, to say, "He's drunk again, come get me." Suddenly, at 12 years of age, my mom decided to disclose the Army major was not my dad, but that my stepfather was really my dad. I was thrilled because Pearson was really a terrible father. He was not only a drunk, but he was very abusive. So it was great. My stepdad was a wonderful man. So I thought, great, let's get rid of this guy. The problem was he sued for custody. So his paternity was eventually disproven via some new DNA technology in the 80s. It proved that he was sterile and could never have fathered anyone. So in the end, my secret biological father turned stepfather became my adopted father because he adopted me to make it legal that I was his, changing my name to Klugman. And I lived the rest of his life thinking that I was really his biological daughter. He died suddenly in 1996 of a heart attack. And all throughout my life, his family was a source of trouble for me. They never accepted me. It was really difficult for me to find any identity through them. Speaking on Mary Catherine's point, I am the only redhead on both sides of the family. And for that side of the family, it was a big issue because I didn't look like them, I didn't act like them. They didn't really consider me a part of their family from day one because I was originally introduced as the stepchild. And then miraculously, I was the biological child. So after my grandmother from Klugman's side, his mother, she passed away in 2014. And after I was surprisingly acknowledged in her will, I took my $200 inheritance from her. The rest went to the other cousins that were really part of her family. I took that $200 and I purchased a 23andMe test with medical and learned that I'm really not 50% Ashkenazi Jewish, which would have come from Klugman. I'm 50% Scottish, which, go figure, I don't look Scottish at all. And that was my second NPE revelation. I forgot to say the punchline at the beginning. My first was when I learned he wasn't really my dad at 12 years old. So in 2014, when I got my 23andMe test results, that was my second NPE revelation. And that's when I hired a genealogist and found this man in the middle. His surname is McLeod. And lo and behold, my elusive biological father. I now have a really good relationship with Mr. McLeod, who lives 40 minutes away from me, my half-brother, who lives in Nashville, my sister-in-law, and my nephew. And as an only child, having a sibling was really, really the best part of any of this. So I've been in private practice as a psychotherapist for about 15 years, and I use my experience as an NPE to develop professional awareness for mental health clinicians to work with NPE, and I see NPEs in my practice, both virtually and in person. So I accept your challenge, Alicia. I'm all over it. And in fact, that's what we are discussing today. I've written a curriculum that I've just submitted for copyright, and yeah, you can see that a little bit. It's okay. A curriculum that I've just submitted for copyright and credentialing through various CEU programs. And it is my goal to teach other clinicians how to work with the comprehensive but unique cluster of circumstances that comprise our mental health needs, none of which is brand new. I'm not recreating the wheel. I'm just combining various known forms of therapy and teaching them how to be more empathetic and not immediately dismiss people. So of the curriculum that I've written, for today's purpose, I've only pulled out the more gritty pieces that tend to be more pervasive. So it's not an introductory type presentation. So here are the main categories we're going to cover today based on the qualities of significant impact, pervasiveness, and then the overall influence on the NPE dynamic at any stage of the process. This is what I'm calling it, Parental Identity Discovery. I get a lot of feedback from various other NPE that I meet. I hate the term NPE. I'm not an event, I'm a person. Some people have changed it to be not parent expected, but I was introduced to it as non-paternal event. I like to refer to it as Parental Identity Discovery, and that's what I'm calling my curriculum. So the first is the 7 key characteristics. Here is a blow-up, which can't really see all that well. I'll read them off to you. The first is the stranger within, then the discovery, the actual discovery. The grief effect is the third, different grief that you go through. The intuition, I didn't have time to talk about that today, but that's a piece that really fascinates me. I find that for a lot of us, we have a very basic intuitive understanding that we are different from the beginning, but we have no context to understand why. And it feeds into our search and the synchronicities that present themselves to get us to where we are. After intuition is the new, what I call the new identity crisis, because it's not the planned identity crises that you have at adolescence or midlife, but a separate one. Then the family matters, how it changes your family dynamics, both the known family and your new biological family. And I can't even read the last thing. In reunion. Being in reunion with the new family, hopefully, if you get there. So it's my conceptualization of what occurs in the NPE from tip to tail, as they say. There are 7 distinct phases of experience that are fluid and dynamic, kind of like a grief cycle itself. And it provides a concrete pathway for NPE to understand our own journey. So in the interest of time, like I said, I only pulled out a few. We're talking about the more pervasive ones. They tend to go in order. Not everybody experiences all of them. Some people don't have the intuitive piece. Other people never get to the reunion phase. So let's talk a little bit about the identity, because that's a big one. That's our first objective today. So identity is a major issue for us. It's an issue for every human being at some point, but usually throughout adolescence, and then again in midlife, not a third time. It's a foundational topic in psychology, and I'm incorporating the big theoretical concepts that shape our understanding of identity thus far, 2 of whom are Abraham Maslow and Erik Erikson, which, if you're familiar with psychology at all, really, really big names. And Erik Erikson, incidentally, was an NPE. Okay, so here we have Erikson's stages of development. These are his construction of what we go through as human beings to understand how we become ourselves. Identity versus role confusion is the adolescence stage. Who am I? Who can I be? Much later comes ego integrity versus despair, and that's somewhere down here. That really is around anywhere from maturity all the way through death, and that really is asking the question, is it okay to be me? Which is, if I'm not mistaken, the foundational concern of what we're all going through. So Erikson's concept here does a great job of ordering the flow of development and the necessary tasks to complete at each level, but it doesn't address where identity comes from. So what does contribute to identity? Quite a lot of different things. I tend to use the lens of evolutionary psychology to provide explanations for things. It's how I understand things, especially human behavior. Kind of an anthropologist at heart, I think. Our environment is essential in shaping our identity because in early human existence, our survival depended on being in our tribe. And being in our tribe was how we worked together, and therefore what value we had within it. Being shunned or evicted from that tribe meant certain death. So experiencing a sense of rejection from family feels threatening for that reason. And when that value changes in our tribe, we experience an identity crisis. So here is my conceptualization of what contributes to identity. It's culture, it's environment, it's neighborhood, it's your gender, your sexuality, your family, your ancestry, all sorts of sports teams even, colleges, especially when legacy. Let's talk about the identity crisis. So when the value that we participate in our tribe with gets called into question, the foundation of who we are crumbles, and we begin to feel threatened. Rebuilding identity can be a protracted experience while stumbling through essentially what is another adolescence. You're trying to find yourself all over again. Trying to locate influencing factors. So in working with identity, here's part of the approach that I use. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, is a really efficient and effective way of dealing with trauma. It's great. In fact, the founder of this particular amazing intervention just passed away a couple weeks ago. It reorganizes the way our brains experience trauma, and it takes the distorted core beliefs that come from those traumas and changes those too. So it doesn't take away memory, but because of the bilateral stimulation that is inherent to the intervention, people often associate it with hypnotherapy, and it's not the same at all. But I use it probably 50-60% of the time in my practice, and it cuts down what would normally take a year, maybe 2 years in therapy into a month or two. Very effective. Very, very good at disconnecting distortions. So the program that I'm creating teaches a 4-step process about how to work with trauma and changing our identity without using EMDR, because not every clinician is trained in EMDR. It's an expensive training. So part of that curriculum recommends identifying one person, the one person in your life who you can confide in, not a therapist. So this would be somebody in addition to your therapist, but somebody who you can confide in but will openly challenge you on poor judgment, bad choices, reflecting your drama. They can see at a high level what's going on, and they can tolerate redundant conversations that happens because of grief. Right? When we go through grief, we tend to keep going through it and keep going through it, and we cycle through it until it starts to lose its power. And that's why the people in our lives end up fading away, because they can't take the redundancy of it. Like, it's too strong. We need to disengage. So this would be the one person that can actually walk through that with you, but is also someone you will listen to when they say, hold on, I think you're just going too far. Let's pull back a little bit, let's look at what you're doing. So that is not the person that you will write off and say, oh my God, you're not supporting me. So finally, I encourage people to explore their cultural differences. I'll pull this up on a bigger slide in a second. Let's say you've reached a dead end, either in you've not been able to identify any specific person, you know the culture that they're coming from, or you've tried to reach out and that particular family is a closed door. They want nothing to do with you. That leaves a hole in identity. I still don't know who I am. I get the sense of who they are. I have a name, but none of that means anything to me until I know them more. So I ask people to start exploring their culture and what those cultural influences are. So hopefully you can see this a little bit better. Attitudes, beliefs, language, customs, rituals, faith, food, art and drama, and behaviors down here. These are all the different influencing factors that contribute to culture at large. So one of the things that I did, without even knowing it throughout my life, was explore Scottish culture. And it was just inherent to my curiosity. It's a synchronicity, as Carl Jung would say, meaningful coincidences that aren't coincidences at all, but the universe trying to put things together for you based on your energy. So I have people do that and say, let's explore that. Film, literature, food. What are you naturally gravitating toward? You probably have a reason for that. All right, moving on rather quickly. Objective number 2 is grief. Here's a quick refresher on the cycle of grief. It is fluid. You may jump from the first one to bargaining, and then back to anger and denial, and all over the place until you finally come to acceptance. Grief is tricky. It's an individual process. It takes the time it takes. You can't rush through it. In fact, you really don't want to rush through grief. But of course it feels bad, and we want it to be over as soon as possible, because we can't tolerate negative feelings. The nature of grief is dynamic, so it can take a very long time, but the process is very necessary, unless it's complicated. Oh, I'll go through this slide first. When attachments are ripped away, It challenges our sense of stability and safety, leaves a hole, a void, and also challenges our identity. So it takes time to rebuild that identity. Consider the identity that you built through your childhood into adolescence and through your college years, your early adult years. It took some time. It took a lot of struggle and a little bit of pain, I bet. So that's what we're going through again. And when you go through grief, you go through it again as well, because you've identified yourself in the person you've lost, in the job you've lost, in the illness that's changed your life or your loved one's life. It rocks our sense of stability as we learn who we are without that influence. So grief becomes a problem when it becomes complicated grief. That's our technical clinical term, complicated grief. It takes a turn for the worse, and I'm witnessing a lot of that in the MPE community that I see online, that I interview in my podcast, the people that are coming into my practice, the regular people that I see on the street, and we happen to talk about MPE things. The complicated grief is much more common in our group because it's essentially an issue of identity change. You can't see yourself any longer in your new life. I would never use EMDR for regular grief because it is a necessary transition that we have to go through to find ourselves again, but I do with the complicated grief. And I encourage anyone who has not been able to move beyond a normal grief stage and has not been able to find elements of a new sense of identity to go seek EMDR. Oops. All right, family dynamics. Come on, let's go. Really? Decided not to work? Oh. Yes. Okay, over the years, I have come to understand that there are two contributing factors to why people seek out therapy, why we have problems to begin with. One is control, and the other is acceptance. Physiological reasons for distress. Sometimes both of them occur together. The control occurs when traumas of survival come up. Right? And people who are holding on, I need to have things go just my way. That's a control issue. Acceptance issues occur when love and affiliation have been withheld. And there's the belief, that kind of distorted cognitive belief, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy. Everything that I see, no matter what it comes in as, whatever the presenting problem is, I can boil down to one of these two issues. And so here's how they express themselves in the NPE population. The known family, the family that you were raised with, may try to wrestle control away from you, right? It's not your information to deal with, it's my secret, you have no right to do this sort of thing, right? That might be the message that comes across. This is based on the distorted perception that they will be excommunicated from their family, perhaps. Their reputations may be at stake. And remember that our primitive brain, that part of our brain that's way back here and was the first part of our evolution, interprets that as a threat. So it becomes an issue for their survival. So much of those scenarios, right, their reputations may be ruined, they will never be successful, they will never find happiness, no man will ever want them, etc., etc., etc. Much of those scenarios throughout history were true for women. So however distorted it feels to us now, especially younger generations who just don't care, none of it makes a damn bit of difference, for everybody in the older generations, it's still very much alive for them. So disavowal from their family meant no financial security, social ostracization, and all of that adds up to that evolutionary equivalent of being evicted from your tribe. And that culminates in a threat to their identity as well. And that's what gets communicated as narcissism. That's when you start seeing the narcissistic behavior come through. And we have to say to our parent, this isn't about you anymore. It was, but now it's about me. And you no longer have ownership of this story. I firmly believe that ownership transfers to us as NPE the moment we're born, but we're little, and as small kids, we don't have the capacity to understand any of this, and we shouldn't be burdened with it until we are old enough to understand it. Somehow my mom decided when I was 12, I was old enough to understand, and I did. So she told me that time, but she didn't tell me the second time, or tell me the right father the first time, but she tried. It would be great if our parents would say, hey, by the way, there's never a good time to bring this up, and I've been looking for one for 10 or 12 or 20 years, so I'm just gonna blurt it out now. Here you go. It would be a lot easier if we found out that way, but that's just not gonna happen very often. So controlling the information allows our family to control the outcome, and that's what they're looking for. If I can control this, then I can control my destiny and my reputation and all of that. Second part, acceptance. Everyone in NPE scenario is struggling with acceptance. And unfortunately, some struggle with it both from the known family and the new biological family. So interestingly, our parents are as well, because some of them are still living in the fear that I will not be accepted in my community if this secret gets out. So their fear of rejection is the basis for their crisis. And fear is the greatest motivator we have above everything else. Boundaries seem to be a four-letter word to most people, and that's probably the hardest thing that I have to work with people on, is how to create healthy boundaries with family, whether they're in PE or not. Boundaries are a hard thing. They're healthy though, and they allow for individual differences and needs to be met and respected. Known family motives can be attempts to use control to manipulate the feeling of acceptance. And I see this a lot. And to that I say, Eleanor Roosevelt's great quote, something to keep in mind when family tries to control the outcome and manipulate your choices. No one can make you feel anything without your permission. All right, we're still exploring family dynamics, but we're talking about being in reunion. 2 words, rejection and reaching out. 2 potential results with a myriad of consequences: resentment, narcissism, acceptance, balancing a lot of egos. Keep in mind, egos are really big, and we tend to overlook them, but that's the reason why the narcissism is coming up. Trying to decide how much of this slide to go into since you can't see it. The rejection is a closed door in exploring reunion with biofamily. It still brings strained dynamics. You can manage a lot of resentment. The reaching out piece over here, balancing 2 families, can be positive. That's actually not such a bad problem to have. However, the known family can feel replaced. That's that ego starting to manifest. Oh, we must not be good enough now that she's found her new family. Here's another good quote from Carl Jung: knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. So when you know what your darkness holds, you're not so thrown by what other people are bringing to you. So when you know, all right, I'm struggling with the rejection piece, I'm struggling with the acceptance piece, maybe I'm not feeling good enough, chances are that's what's coming from your family as well. That's what they're trying to bring to you, to manipulate you back into the status quo once you know all of that, it's a lot easier to deal with. So let's talk about how to deal with that. Everybody remember the A-Team? Hannibal from the A-Team? I love it when a plan comes together. It's one of my favorite shows. So I believe that having a plan, and that is not visible at all, that's too bad. I believe that having a plan is really essential to working through problematic issues. Because without the plan, you tend to react pretty emotionally. You're thrown off guard, you say things you don't want to say, or you don't say anything at all and you freeze. But having a plan lets you work through, if this happens, then I'll do this. And if that happens, then I'll do that. So this is essentially a flowchart, an if-then flowchart. But I'll be happy if anybody wants one. You can come look at it.
I think since everybody gave us their emails when they signed in, if you want to send me this up as a handout,
yeah.
Email it to everybody.
Excellent. Because this is pretty exciting.
Looks very useful.
If you can work it out with your one person or with your therapist, you can create so if I meet so-and-so and they are rejecting, then here's how I'll handle it, here's what I'll say. It can get really detailed. Or if I reach out and I get nothing back, or I get conditions, or mom becomes narcissistic, whatever it is, you map out a plan that once you know, here's what I could do if this happens, and here's what I could do if that happens, you start to settle psychologically. It's like a tether. So by means of analogy, my kids have a 504 plan, which for anybody who has special needs, it's like an IEP, but a lighter version. Sorry?
I have 3 of them.
There you go. So I have 2. This accommodates my kids' ADHD. It's a living and breathing document that is fluid. It follows them throughout their school career into their college to help them with whatever accommodations they need. This flowchart, if-then flowchart, is based on that concept. It's changeable. It's fluid. As you discover things, as you process more, as your identity starts to shift, you can change this plan. But you have a roadmap that helps you find your way and follows your progress. There's more about your one person. Integral to my curriculum is the concept of the one person. They reserve judgment, but won't withhold concern or feedback. They can challenge you, and you can take it. And you'll recognize this is being done out of support and love, because that's essentially what therapists do. You just pay us to do it. All right. The long-term effects of disenfranchisement and exclusion and feeling the outsider significantly affects our mental health and well-being. So in addition to the one person, is finding community. That's what we're doing here. We're finding community so that we can see our reflection in our tribe, because our one person is nice and our therapist is great, but it's not enough to be a tribe, and that's what we are here. All right, changing perspective, also called mindset, outlook, whatever you want to call it. Changing perspective focuses us on how you look or think at something in order to change how you experience it. In my vernacular, we would call that cognitive behavioral therapy. As you've journeyed through this experience, I assume you've assimilated some things, but continue to identify other areas that need attention, and this comes from gaining information. And that's what you need in order to change perspective. Let's see. That's not going to work at all, so I'm not going to do it. I could try it, but I kind of doubt it. Okay, kind of see that, how the picture is changing? It's a Mavericks game that I have with a cool 360-degree camera. So as you start from one perspective and the camera starts to move around, you're gaining new information, right? You're seeing new things. That's how I view perspective, changing your perspective. And you won't be able to do that until you have new information to consider. Okay. All right. So now you have a snapshot into a formalized intervention for NPE that I call Parental Identity Discovery. It's a passion born out of sweat and tears, adjustment to a second NPE, but also the grief of a second father to gain a third. And that is me. Any questions? Any questions? Yes.
Has your discovery, finding out your Celtic background, changed anything within your celebratory traditions? Do you now?
Absolutely. It's like you follow my Facebook page. Anybody heard of Hogmanay? Hogmanay is Celtic New Year. I celebrate Celtic New Year. World Tartan Day, any excuse to put on a kilt? Sure, all of it. Yeah, I love it. I incidentally learned from the genealogist I hired that I was Scottish when I was vacationing in Scotland with my family and didn't know yet. It was really cool. Synchronicity. Other questions? Yes?
Do you have a website?
I do. Oh, you can't see it. I keep forgetting that. All right, jkrabb with 2 B's.com.
For emails also on the brochure, so you guys can always email them.
Yeah. And I have cards up here if you want one that has my website on it, my phone number, all that. So that's up here. Any other questions? Yeah.
Alright, as far as the complicated grief goes, you said unable to find your, or reestablish your identity after the fact. So, does that mean, like in the grieving process, like, you know, you're not experiencing grief, say, sobbing or whatever, but
You're stuck in the sobbing, yeah.
Sorry?
You would be stuck in the sobbing piece.
Oh, okay.
Because sobbing is a perfectly natural component early on in grief,
Right.
but you should be moving through it. That time heals all wounds adage is absolutely true. So as you're going through time, if it's not changing, becoming easier, which is a horrible way of saying adjusting
Yeah.
to it, then that's problematic, right? Anything longer than 6 months to a year of that is really problematic. The first year of grief, you're going through all the different changes of the anniversaries, all the holidays, the first time, everything, all the firsts. So you give it a good year, and then after that, if it's really not changing, that's considered complicated.
Okay. I'll get in touch with you because I'm confused about something, but.
Okay, you see me after too.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
I'm sure you experienced neglect in your childhood.
Yes.
Do you see a correlation between neglect and the MPE experience?
That's an interesting question. I have not been aware of that as a correlation yet, but it's something to look into.
Can you repeat the question he asked you?
Yes, he's asking if I'm seeing a correlation between neglect in our childhoods and becoming NPE. You'd think it might be likely considering the narcissism from one or both parents, but I'll distinguish between narcissistic personality disorder, verifiable, and certainly a lot of our moms have it, but then there's also just plain narcissistic behavior without being personality disordered. And this sort of situation, especially when your brain is feeling threatened, like my survival is at stake, those behaviors can be narcissistic, and they don't have to be a narcissistic person in terms of a disorder, if that makes any sense. Are we done?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.